Third mistake is disconnecting from any city church expression. So sometimes people, I think they get too idealistic about house church, and they think that as an expression within the house church, you have everything that you will ever need to grow, everything that you will ever need to experience, everything that the church was meant to be. In the same way, when there's 100 commands given to the church in the New Testament that can only be fulfilled in the context of a small community, there are actually a lot of commands given to the church that are very difficult to do in a house church environment. So because of that, it's really important for us to understand that the city church is important. So our ecclesiology, our understanding of church here is that there are the word ecclesia, this word that is translated church in the New Testament. It's used in about three different ways throughout the New Testament. About a third of the time, it really is referring to a gathering of people in a household. So this is where in Romans 16, it says, greet the church that meets in your house. Greet the ecclesia that meets in your house. There's a lot of that in the New Testament. And so we're going to be talking primarily about that kind of expression of the church in this 6-month cohort. But about a third of the time, the New Testament also uses the word church to talk about the city, right? So in the book of Revelation, Jesus is saying, I'm going to write a letter to the church of Laodicea, the church of Ephesus, the church of, Smyrna, Thyatira. These are city churches. These are not simply house churches. We know that in those cities, there were house churches, but there was also a city church expression, and all of the commands given to the church in Revelation 1, 2, and 3 were not given to house churches. They were all given to the city church. And so it's really important to understand the difference. And I would say that most house churches I know are sitting on a 2-year time bomb. In other words, about 2 years they can survive without connection with a larger city church expression before something happens that's so difficult for them to endure that it really takes them under. And I think this is unnecessary, because if you were a part of either, and that larger expression could be a network of house churches, it could be a very friendly traditional church that really appreciates what you're doing. You could be a part of a traditional church and just be doing this as a house community, but that traditional church really, really values this expression of the church and maybe even sees it as a part of the expression of the church. One of the churches that we're very friendly with here in Cincinnati, they make very clear to the whole congregation that the house groups are just as much a front door to the church as the worship service. I think that's a beautiful expression, a way of describing it. And it provides a lot of opportunity for people to really prioritize those house expressions, sometimes even above the worship service expression. So we're obviously going to be talking almost exclusively about the house church here, but from time to time, I'm going to be emphasizing the importance of finding a way to connect with the city church. What will you do if a marriage within your church just blows up? Do you really have within your house church all that you need to handle that? We've been through a lot as a house church that we couldn't handle without kind of escalating the issue to others in the city who are more gifted than we are. Somebody going through a really difficult addiction, things like that. There may be people, and your house church may be able to handle some of those really big curveballs, but you'll likely get hit with one every couple of years that is just above your pay grade, and that's okay. So we really believe in those expressions. The other third of the time the church is mentioned in the New Testament is talking about all believers everywhere. So when Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church, my ecclesia, he didn't mean a house church. He didn't mean a city church. He meant all the believers throughout history and in all places. So those are the three ways of understanding the church. Now, the problem is that 99% of the time when people use the word church in our context in the West, they're really talking about none of those three things. They're not talking about a house church, they're talking about the city church, and they're not really talking about all believers everywhere. They're really talking about this branded church, this thing that's larger than the house but smaller than the city. But I think that because that's probably the closest we're going to get to an expression of the city church in many cases. So we have to get kind of creative with how to access more gifts, right? More resources in the city. And sometimes those traditional churches can be great partners. We'll talk more about that too.